San Diego, California, December 5, 1846. As a dreary overcast sky looms above them, Captain Archibald Gillespie and his detachment of 40 U.S. Marines ride east from the city into the dry, chaparral-covered desert that looms endlessly before them. They are on their way to join forces with Brigadier General Stephen F. Kearney and his force of 200 troops, who have sent word to the Marines that they are caught in dire straits in the middle of the Southern California desert. General Kearney and his men have traveled to their current location, roughly 30 miles east of the bustling pueblo of San Diego, as part of the United States' efforts during the ongoing Mexican-American War. Though they have endured seemingly endless hardships on their journey from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to the city of Santa Fe, and then across the vast expanses of the deserts of present-day New Mexico and Arizona, before finally reaching the deserts of Alta California, most of the men are eager to find and engage their enemy in the Mexican army. However, General Kearney's force is still diminutive in size and thousands of miles away from their closest support to the east. Seeing the increasingly dangerous circumstances, Kearney had seen it necessary to send a rider to San Diego requesting reinforcements. This request reached the headquarters of Captain Archibald Gillespie, where he had hurriedly marshaled the contingent of U.S. Marines he now leads eastward in their effort to reach General Kearney and his men before they are forced to engage with the local forces that are surely reconnoitering the hills around them. These local forces, Gillespie and his men are well aware, are unlike the rest of their counterparts in the Mexican army, whom the U.S. forces have combated in the previous few years. With Alta or Upper California comprising the northernmost reaches of Mexican territory, its inhabitants, Mexican citizens known as Californios, have adapted their country's culture to fit their environs. In the vast expanses of California ranchos, which could comprise thousands of acres, becoming an adept horseman was essential not only for working vaqueros, but also everyday citizens simply wishing to get from one place to another in this expansive land. Throughout the whole of Mexico, the Californios were regarded as unmatched in not only their horsemanship, but their adroitness in wielding their long leather riatas, precursors to the modern-day cowboy's rope. It was said that a Californio would rather climb atop his horse and ride 100 yards rather than walk it, and that any Californio was a better roper with his foot than the average Mexican was with his hand. But these are not the only attributes that separate the Californio soldiers that General Kearney and his men will be facing and the regular Mexican army fighting further to the south. Their most noticeable characteristic, and perhaps their most dangerous, is evident even from afar to the scouts and soldiers watching them from the cover of the dense chaparral brush. Long, steel-tipped lances jut upward several feet from over the heads of each Californio rider, giving them an air of medieval simplicity that seems antiquated even here in the 1840s Southern California desert. But, while many among the Americans find the spectacle to be nearly comical, the damage that these lances can inflict is far from a laughing matter for anyone faced with combating them. Though the Californios are lacking in way of firearms and ammunition, their ability to inflict grievous wounds upon their adversaries before dashing away gives them a capability scarcely seen outside of the mighty tribes of the American plains, like the Cheyenne, the Lakota, and the Comanche. Against a fighting force armed with single-shot carbines, they present a formidable foe. It had been at what history has come to know as the Battle of the Old Woman's Gun, when a detachment of unfortunate U.S. Navy sailors, Marines, and civilian volunteers had attempted to march on the burgeoning city of Los Angeles in an effort to quell an uprising in the area that had been previously conquered by American forces. This detachment, composed of 310 men, had been caught by the Californios just outside of the city and made to pay dearly over the course of a battle that lasted a night and the succeeding day. During the engagement, 4 American sailors had been killed, and 6 additional men gravely wounded at the end of the Californios' lances. Captain Archibald Gillespie, for his part, has spent the previous few months clinging tenuously to any semblance of power over the city of Los Angeles, having been appointed to the post by Robert F. Stockton, with explicit orders to rule over the city with a strict eye and an unforgiving hand. But, after continued unrest from the inhabitants of the city, with some in support of the Americans' efforts and some vehemently opposed, Stockton and Gillespie retreated southward by sailing to San Diego on October 26, 1846. They arrived 5 days later, on October 31st, and were welcomed by the local inhabitants of the besieged city to take part in their celebrations of All Souls' Day. However, despite their warm reception, the men had found San Diego to be all but bereft of usable horses, mules, and cattle. While Stockton had returned north to Monterey, where Commanding Officer John C. Fremont was experiencing similar problems, Captain Gillespie and his men had set about procuring as many animals and supplies as they could while staying within the good graces of the citizens. At this critical juncture in the Mexican-American War, the Americans now found themselves clinging to largely nominal control of the Southern California coastline stretching down from San Francisco. They were running low on men, ammunition, and supplies. However, General John Kearney, on his trek westward from the desert, mistakenly believed his countrymen to have solidified a strong measure of control over nearly the whole of the territory. In the middle of the New Mexico desert, Kearney and his men had happened upon none other than the legendary mountain man Kit Carson, whom John C. Fremont had dispatched to Washington to carry correspondence regarding the Americans' progress in Alta California. After reviewing these dispatches, General Kearney had felt so hopeful as to the state of the Americans' advancement that he sent nearly half of his forces back to Santa Fe. He did, however, enlist the famed Carson to accompany him and his men back to Southern California. Now, Carson, among the most experienced in the group by far in matters of frontier warfare, rides with Kearney's cavalry, dressed in his mountain man trappings and sitting astride his sure-footed mule. He shares Kearney's growing concern with the group's isolation. The men amongst the cavalry, however, are by and large in high spirits, despite the toll taken on themselves and their animals by the months-long journey west. They have come here to fight what they believe to be a markedly inferior enemy, not only lacking in their training and equipment, but in fact relegated to using centuries-old technology in a desperate bid against a superior foe. Still, the obviousness of their predicament is not lost on the men of the cavalry, and all among them welcome the sight of Captain Gillespie and his Marines rumbling towards them in the afternoon, kicking up a sizable cloud of dust and towing with them a small brass cannon to add to the artillery firepower of the soldiers. Kearney and Carson both warmly greet Gillespie, who informs the general, much to his chagrin, that the state of affairs for the Americans in Southern California has deteriorated, even in the time since Carson has skulked out of San Diego with his secret correspondence for President James K. Polk. He also assures them that their suspicions that the Californios might be very close by are likely justified. Unfortunately for the Americans, Gillespie is more correct than he knows, as word of he and his men's departing San Diego has already reached two nearby parties of Californio Lancers. One, commanded by Leonardo Cota and Jose Alipas, is stationed at San Luis Rey to the north. When word reaches their headquarters, a contingent of Lancers immediately heads south to join forces with their brethren in order to mount an attack. Meanwhile, the second contingent of Lancer forces, commanded by Don Andreas Pico, brother of the governor Pio Pico, is stationed in San Diego. Don Andreas commands virtually the whole of the city outside of the American-held ports. He has now received word that the group of Marines has evaded Mexican security forces and is headed east into the desert. As yet unaware of Kearney's forces, they assume the men are yet again attempting to scour the countryside in search of horses and cattle. The two forces meet at San Luis Rey, where Pico, the senior officer, sees fit to divide their forces in an effort to more effectively scout the vast expanse of desert. Half of the men are sent south to El Cajon, while Pico and his contingent of 78 men make their way east into the desert, scouring the landscape for any sign of intruding American forces. In the late afternoon, the Californios arrive at the small Native American village of San Pasqual. The residents, largely terrified of the Californios after decades of incursion and mistreatment on their part, flee their homes, leaving their shelters to Pico and his men. But that evening, as Pico and his men cook their evening meals over the coals of the natives' fires, one of the tribespeople suddenly comes running back into the village, reporting that they have been found and detained by nearby American forces, numbering far larger than Pico had expected Captain Gillespie's force of Marines to be. Believing the natives' claims to be either lies or outright delusions, Pico largely dismisses them. However, only a few miles away, the flickering candles inside General Kearney's field headquarters tent illuminate the shadows of Kearney, Gillespie, Kit Carson, and a number of other officers as they now discuss what steps to take next, knowing that their enemy is almost certainly close at hand. It is decided that scouts will be sent out to reconnoiter the area and determine the size and strength of the Californios' forces. Lieutenant Thomas C. Hammond is appointed to command a small group of scouts, including some local natives, among them a man named Rafael Machado, who is familiar with both the tactics of the Californios as well as the terrain. In the pre-dawn hours, they ride into the countryside, disappearing into the darkness. Soon, Machado has discerned the location of the Californios at San Pasqual. He even crawls forward through the brush, garnering a close enough vantage point to confirm that these mostly sleeping men are in fact Pio's forces. But after Machado is gone for a longer time than he had planned, Lieutenant Hammond becomes anxious that the native Californio Machado has double-crossed him and alerted Pico's men to his presence. Concerned that they will be the victims of an ambush, Hammond orders the remainder of his men to follow him in a silent charge into the village. Despite the men remaining silent, the clattering of their weapons and the pounding of their horses' hooves alert the Californio sentries on watch. Machado is discovered by his companions in this charge, having in fact steadfastly done his duty, and now remounts and joins his cohorts in a hurried retreat as the Californio guards order them to halt. In their haste, one of the soldiers drops their dark blue coat, with the tag U.S. Army sewn on it. Now, not only is Pico aware of the presence of the Americans, he has evidence that there is a larger force afoot than the 39 Marines who had left San Diego. As Lieutenant Hammond breathlessly reports the news of their discovery to General Kearney, Kearney mulls over his options. He decides, against the advice of Carson, that since the element of surprise has now been lost, they must make their attack as quickly as possible. As an early morning frost coats the blankets of the sleeping men, and a thick fog covers the landscape, they are suddenly shaken awake by their officers, and told to make ready for a charge. After shaking off their restless night's sleep, many of the young men are eager to mount up and make the charge to glory that they have traveled so far to take part in. Kearney has, however, taken a number of steps in order to mitigate their risk. He has ordered that their main objective will be to surround the village of San Pasqual, capture their horses, and take the men prisoner. However, the general, Carson, and Gillespie are all dubious as to whether or not this plan will be entirely realistic. Meanwhile, the forward observers from Pico's force of Californios dot the horizon with their silhouettes, keenly gathering some rather surprising intelligence as they take stock of the number of Americans present, not so large that an attack would be out of the question, and the condition of their stock, who are now so gaunt after their cross-continental trek that many of them seem near death. Within 15 minutes of being awakened, the men are organizing into their well-drilled formations in preparation for battle. When they had first left Kansas, their companies had been arranged according to the color of their horses, their animals well-fed and energetic, the men's uniforms pressed and well-kempt, and their weapons cleaned, oiled, and ready for use. Now, many of the men ride mules or horses mismatched from their units, and the animals' current state significantly affects their ability to perform. To make matters worse, their carbines cannot be counted on to fire in the damp morning conditions. Thus, this attack will be relegated to swords and single-shot pistols, with the carbine's only use now being in wielding it as a club. The men separate into 3 guards, with the advance guard being commanded by Captain Abram R. Johnston. General Kearney commands the guard behind them, but as the men move out towards the small valley that ensconces the village of San Pasqual, they begin to separate from each other at a greater and greater rate during the course of their travel. As the men near the village, a critical mishap takes place. With the distance between them making the commands all but inaudible, General Kearney's command for Captain Johnston to proceed in a, quote, trot is misheard as a gallop. This is a grave mistake, as the distance to the village is too far for the exhausted horses to reach at full speed, and the advanced force would be too far ahead of the second column for the second column to provide adequate relief. Still, Johnston dutifully issues the order, and the men in the advanced column urge their horses into a gallop. Seeing this, General Kearney is horrified. He exclaims, "Good heavens, I did not mean that!" However, it is too late. and now the distance between the two forces grows even faster. Snapping into action, Kit Carson urges his mule into a full gallop of its own, attempting to catch up to the runaway column, as Kearney keeps his troops at a trot so as not to lose complete control of the battle before it begins. Carson and his mule catch up to the charging Captain Johnston, whose column is now reaching the expanse of the open valley floor. A half a mile away, they can see the village. The attack is now imminent. The 12-man column charges on, with its men roaring out in whoops and battle cries as they make their charge upon the village. But Pico and his Californios have taken cover in a small ravine next to the village, and from here let loose an initial volley of musket fire from their limited collection of firearms. As the gun smoke mixes with the thick fog, Captain Johnston falls from his mount, killed by a musket ball to the head. Riding directly behind him, Kit Carson sees the captain fall. This trips up his own mount, and his normally sure-footed mule takes a disastrous tumble to the ground, launching Carson several yards ahead of the animal, where he lands splayed out and in a daze, before hurriedly scrambling out of the way of the rest of the charging column. The charging soldiers attempt to loose a volley of their own, but most find that their weapons have indeed been rendered useless in the damp conditions. Now, the 11 remaining Americans draw their long sabers and charge head-on towards the Californios. At first, the Californios feign a retreat, momentarily seeming to scatter their forces to the west as they flee along the path of a small creek near the village. Captain Ben Moore, now the officer in charge with Johnston having been killed in the action, orders the men to pursue the Californios immediately. This the men do, giving chase down the banks of the small waterway. But this pursuit draws out their forces even further, making them easy targets for their enemy. As Kearney, Gillespie, and the rest of the men make their way across the valley as quickly as they can on their bedraggled mounts, they can only watch the horror that unfolds next. The Californios, seeing the compromised state of the Americans' forces, now wheel their fine, well-fed, and well-trained horses around, and make a head-on charge towards the soldiers still pursuing them. Within moments, they have surrounded the Americans in a whirling cyclone from which they can strike with their long lances, inflicting deep, grievous wounds, while others among them throw their leather riatas with expert efficiency, ensnaring and unsaddling riders who can then be pounced upon and dispatched in brutal fashion by other lance-wielding Californios. Captain Moore charges at Captain Pico himself, firing off an errant shot from his single-shot pistol before drawing his saber. He engages Pico, an expert swordsman, who manages to slash Moore with his own saber. As Moore attempts to fight off Pico's sword slashes and thrusts, 2 of Pico's men make separate charges upon the American officer, driving their lances deep into his torso and eventually sending him crumbling to the ground. The fall breaks the blade of Moore's saber, leaving him only the handle of the weapon with which to defend himself. He crawls to a spot near the river, attempting to club and bash any Californio who comes near, but he is soon finished off by a Californio with a pistol. Now, more Americans are starting to arrive at the battlefield, including General Kearney and Captain Gillespie. As he fights, Kearney is viciously wounded by a lance that pierces his lower back. Gillespie fights off numerous vociferous attacks directed at him by a number of attacking lancers, many of whom know who he is and are intent on exacting vengeance upon him personally. For his part, Kit Carson has managed to obtain one of the carbines from the dead U.S. soldiers, one that he miraculously finds to be in working order. He now sits ensconced behind a small rock formation, proffering effective, lethal fire against any Californio who comes within range of his position. Finally, the brass cannons being towed towards the rear of the third column are brought to the field by the American forces, and a powerful volley is let loose towards the Californios. Though it has little effect in the way of lethality, it does manage to momentarily scatter Pico's forces. Now, as Pico and his men survey the battlefield from out of range of the cannons, they are overwhelmed with a collective joy at not only having survived, but tactically dominated a better trained, better equipped, and much larger opposition force. For their part, General Kearney, Captain Gillespie, and Kit Carson are now left to survey a macabre scene of death and gore that seems to cover the whole of the valley floor. They are now trapped here, with many dead and many wounded, still 30 miles from the nearest friendly forces in San Diego, and with Pico and his Californios now stalking the hills all around them in order to cut off any route of escape. During the night, the men who are uninjured go about the grisly task of digging a large communal grave for their comrades, before laying their bodies down inside of it, covering them up, and walking their horses over the top to tamp down the ground to keep their comrades' bodies safe from the frothing packs of hungry wolves that now seem to fill the valley, having smelled the blood and viscera that now litter its floor. In the next few days, the Californios will take great hope in their ability to perhaps defend themselves from the encroaching American forces after so many months of doubt. They will hound General Kearney's forces, making any likelihood of their escape to San Diego, especially with many wounded in tow, nearly impossible. It will ultimately be up to Kit Carson, as well as a native guide and a naval officer, who will volunteer to make a death-defying nighttime trek to San Diego in hopes of garnering relief forces for their comrades. But the story of Kit Carson and his comrades' impossible task, and the conclusion of the brutal, bloody, and callous Mexican-American War are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to free episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the Join button below. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.